uh, before we can get into all that, we need to talk a little bit about how it was. So if you want to take any notes, my intention was there at the top on the front, just where it's across the top where it says like how things used to be. Our presidential election process has changed dramatically since 1972. So really from the kind of development of the modern party system that we have up until through 1968, what would happen was people like you and I, like the voters in the states, may or may not go do a primary. We may or may not get to go to a caucus, who knows. And then eventually, people would be chosen to go to these national conventions. At the national conventions, they would really end up deciding who the presidential candidate was going to be. People that got to go to national conventions were like what you think of as like party bosses. You know, I had this vision of like big fat white men with like whiskey and suits, and I mean it sounds really silly, but that's what it was. Like regular people didn't get to go to the convention. It was people that were maybe journalists, people that were, you know, big politicians, big donors. They would go to these conventions and they would choose who they wanted to represent the party. So that's why, like, early in history, there are a lot of presidential candidates, people who were president, who were actually considered by both parties. So the party would pick the person, not the voters picking the person. Okay? And it's pretty much accepted. That's kind of how things happen. But remember, we start extending rights to people. We have the progressive movement, and then we have the civil rights movement. Well, all these things start to happen, and suddenly your votes are supposed to matter. Then we come up to the 1968 convention. Think about everything you know about our country. So President Johnson to run during Vietnam. We have effectively franchised and fulfilled the promise of the 15th Amendment. And we have this very, like this sense that like individuals deserve protection of their liberties. Okay? So then that's going to lead up to the Democratic Convention, and let me show you what happened.
For Democrats, the Chicago Convention of 1968 was a nightmare. Leading after the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, Democrats fell into chaos, fighting Chicago police and each other.
With George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Mr. Daley is not pleased with Senator Riddick.
How hard it is to accept the truth.
Vice President Hubert Humphrey, hobbled by the unpopularity of President Johnson and his Vietnam War policies, appealed for order.
Surely we have now learned the lesson that violence breeds counter-violence, and it cannot be condoned, whatever the source.
It didn't work. Humphrey's November defeat ushered in the era of Republican presidential dominance, with 7 GOP victories in the last 10 elections.
So not only did it cause the Democratic Party to really, lose, but the other thing that it did is it caused them to like reassess. You know, if we've done everything we can to make sure that people have the right to vote, then why aren't we making sure that their vote actually matters?
What was the third?
Say it again?
He just said 7 out of 10. I'm trying to think of the third Democratic win. I mean, there's Obama, Clinton, and
Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter.
So then what's going to happen is during that process, after the 68 convention, I know you can't see that because it's in purple, but it's called the McGovern-Fraser Commission. So what's going to happen is the Democrats are going to call this commission, and they're going to evaluate the process for what happens at the national convention. What do we do? How do we choose our candidates? And they decide that, we've got to change this. And so one of the things they said is we need to make it so that people who are chosen as delegates to the national convention, no longer do they have to be party elites. They can be anybody. I could go to the convention, Urte could go to the convention, Cameron can go to the convention, anybody. Okay? If you are a registered voter and you participate in your party and your party chooses you, you do have an option to go to the national convention. Well, that's going to be really different than people that are big political donors. They're people that are going to represent their constituents, and they're going to represent their friends and their community. The other thing that they're going to say is that potentially we should move away from these caucus kind of meetings that are closed doors, and we should institute elections. And so you're going to find that many states are going to move to having a primary instead of a caucus. Here's the consequence of the McGovern-Fraser Commission. I have voted in every presidential election since 1992. I have never, since 1992, seen a national convention happen where we didn't already know who the party was going to pick. Up until 1968, we never knew. And I actually heard on the radio this morning, they were talking about, could we have a brokered convention this year for the Republicans? That means, could we make it to the national convention and not know who's going to win? It's always a possibility. I will never say again in this class that nothing can happen, because clearly I see that I sometimes am wrong. But the likelihood, it's unlikely, and I'm going to show you why, but it's probably more likely this year than it's been in a really long time because of some of the changes the parties haven't made, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you another clip from the 1972 convention so you can just kind of see the contrast. This is actually a campaign ad that you're going to see. So George McGovern is going to end up running for president. Obviously he didn't win because there's no President McGovern, but you can just kind of see the contrast.
It was almost dawn in Miami when the final moments came. But the lateness of the hour did not dim the emotion in that hall. For the victory they celebrated was not his alone.
My nomination is all the more precious in that it is the gift of the most open political process in all of our political history.
The reforms had worked, for in Miami that night were people from the entire length and breadth of their party. Some were professionals, many were amateurs, but they all were Democrats, and they all shared the belief that this year, each of them would make a difference.
I'm a housewife and a mother and a dairy farmer. I have one son, 17, and he was very anxious to do the driving. And so he offered to take me down, but he also told me if I didn't vote correctly, I'd walk home, and his vote was for McGovern.
Yeah, I've been in politics since 1960, and I think that's a difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party to begin with. I think the Democratic Party is a party of the people, the ones who care.
There were only 3 from the delegation that had never been to a convention before. We were all new, and we didn't have a moment's free time. And, you know, the first night went 10 hours.
People feel as if there's no way they can influence what happens. And I always felt that way. And in fact, that's the really great thing about, I went to the National Democratic Convention, you know. A lot of people said, oh, you lost prime time by being up all night. Well, that to me was great. And every delegate that was there stayed there and stayed with it.
The state senators and the members of the House of Delegates and all of these new people really worked hard.
The everyday person in our section, they were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and salami sandwiches right there on the convention floor because they didn't have the money to eat in the hotels and restaurants. It wasn't a convention to play. The Miami people, the hotel people, and the restaurant people were very unhappy because we didn't play.
We worked hard on the floor, and we had freedom of the floor to work in the way that we wanted to work.
Why are people able to participate? Because they're participating, then the politicians, or he in this case, will have to listen to what the people say. He's going to respond to the people.
People were voting in their own conscience. I saw that myself. I saw democracy happening right there on the floor.
Our mood together, this was great. We worked as a team.
Well, it was just fantastic. It was the first time I've ever seen anything that's supposed to not work.
This is the people's nomination.
All right, so you get the basic idea, right? Everything that you just saw was focused on the Democratic Party because that's where the problem started, and they were the ones that first made the change. The Republicans will eventually, they will also adopt these reforms. So both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party now conduct their business this way. And so it's the same. There are some semantic differences, like some logistical differences in what they do, but for the purposes of like what's the heart and the intention of the convention, it's the same. Okay, Gabby, what did we say is the other thing they do at the convention? Maybe it wasn't your group. Maybe it was yours group. What did we say is the other thing they do? Good. They write their party platform. So you see, like, okay, how does it take you 10 hours to choose a presidential candidate? Well, I'm going to show you why. But that's not all they're doing. Remember that they're also formulating what the party's going to stand for. So as a person, like, even if I've supported a candidate that's not going to win, getting to go to the national convention is awesome because you get to help to decide the direction of the party because they're going to ratify and vote on like the different parts of the platform, which says that's what the party is going to stand for and believe in for the next 4 years. That's pretty dynamic, okay? All right, so if you'll flip your paper over then, we're going to look at question 2. Question 2 says, what led to the McGovern-Fraser Commission on Convention Reform? To what extent does the increase in reforms make the selection of candidates more democratic with little d, so more people control? You guys are welcome to answer this together if you would like.